So I am John Riviello. I work at Comcast. I've been there for almost 18 years now. I'm John Riv on the internet. Used to be on Twitter a lot. It's been sad since then, but you look for John Riv, probably gonna find me on the internet there. And this is a talk that I really like it. It's again, a lot of my talks based on the experience I've been through that I'm going to share with others that can hopefully be applicable to you. This one about decision making, obviously. And since it is kind of the post-lunch talk, got a little more energy here. We're going to play a game to start off, which is let's make a decision. Okay, so that's what we're here for. Understand how to make decisions. So again, I've been writing code for a long time, and I often get asked the question by people either new to programming or think about going into programming, or they know someone that wants to get into programming. They're just like, hey, John, and we've been doing this a long time. Like, what programming language should I or someone learn first? Which is a great question. It's hard to answer that question. I struggle with that. Because really the answer is it depends. This is actually what you learn when you become more senior in a group. It's just this is your answer to everything. It depends. But it really does depend. What do you want to do with your code? You know, it's certain things are better for different tools and different codes are better for different situations. But I need to give an answer. Like, you cannot code in the language. It depends. At least not that I know of. Maybe that's a JS framework that came out today. But again, I need to answer this question in a way that's useful. And in 2025, you of course go to the AI overlords and have them answer the question. So I go to ChatGPT and I say, hey, what's your advice for this? And ChatGPT is apparently the advanced software engineer, because it says there are several possible options, and if there's one that fails, okay, here's, exactly, it depends in very long, randomly generated text. It gave 5 options. I'm like, okay, I want one, just give me one, just pick one. Then it's like, well, there's really not just one best thing. I'm like, really? Like, you're supposed to be all the answers to my questions and all my problems, and you're just not helping me here. So what I did was then I did some of my own research. And I talked to people, and I've determined that the actual best answer to this is Python. Now, y'all just had a reaction, just like this. We're at a JS conference. Why is Python on the screen? What is happening here? So just take a second and just like note how you're feeling when I was crazy and put Python on the screen right there. You might agree, but hey, yeah, that makes sense. Or you're just like, what's going on right now? Or you're just like straight up mad with me. Like, what are you thinking? You lost your mind. The AI overlords stick it to you and they poisoned your brain. And to that, I'll say, actually, this is not my answer. This is actually, I asked a professor at a college. I'm like, what do you think? He's like, it's Python. That's the answer, done. But that's, again, there's lots of different ways you can go about answering this depending on the situation. And this is just an example of the fact that, like, you want to try to come to a decision. How do you make the right decision in that situation? So decisions you can make it work. They could be big, they could be small. And we want to talk about ways we actually go ahead and make a decision, no matter how big or small it is. Whenever these decisions come and present themselves to you or your group or your team or your company, the question is kind of, how to make that decision and who's going to make that decision. Is it a group? Is it an individual? Is it a team? What is that team? How do you pick it? So there's a few approaches to handling this. One is to just take the most senior engineer in the room and say, you go ahead and make that decision. So fortunately for me, that's usually me. So that's one option there. I can be like, hey, I'm here. We're doing this. Not the best way, I would say. Sometimes it is. I need to just kind of walk and be like, okay, this is where we're going, just to force a decision forward. But I want to be, more mindful about who's in the room. How can we go about this in a better way? So another approach is take everyone involved and just have an equal democratic vote. Yeah, I love this. So I work with a coworker that has a goat farm, and every year on election day, he gets the I voted sticker and puts it on his goat's face and tweets or puts on Instagram, I goated in. It's awesome. And it works. You could do equal majority vote, majority wins, just, hey, this is what we're going to go with, because the more people said so. But there's also has you thinking about just, okay, should everyone have an equal vote in your decision? There's meritocracy-based decision-making. That's kind of just like those that are more the experts get more weight in that. Is that maybe, maybe not? There's also the concept of wisdom of the crowds. So this is actually first observed and recorded by Aristotle over 2,000 years ago. And when I watched Who Wants to Be a Millionaire back in the day, it seemed to work pretty well for that. You ask a random audience, they were pretty good at guessing the answer. There's actually been a great deal of research around wisdom of the crowds and why it actually is so effective. And there was this article I found a number of years ago that really dug into this. And what they found was that if you take many independent from different people judgments and you combine them to kind of determine what is the overall decision there, that is often found to be more accurate than if you were to go to an expert and ask them for their decision in a certain problem. And this article really dug into more just like, do you get the right answer? It was kind of trying to understand why is this the case. And they found some hidden costs if you just blindly adopt wisdom of the crowd. So to help demonstrate what they found, we've got another exercise here. And for this, I'm going to take this question from this Google article that's a number of years ago, and I've really kind of taken a snippet of it that is totally out of context, but actually out of context that works well for this example. In this example, there's this talk about how there's this great programmer, this teacher actually, named Testivus. And a programmer asked Testivus, I'm going to write some unit tests. What code coverage should I aim for? What is the percentage of code coverage I should be aiming for? To which Testivus replies, 80% and no less. He's very angry. He's like, this is the way it is. 80% is the number, at least the minimum. That's the way to go. Now, the point of this blog post is that actually the answer is much more nuanced than that. But what happens if someone gives an estimate first, like in this case, where Testivus says the answer is 80%? How does that impact others' opinions on that? And that's what the researchers wanted to understand in this article. So what they did was they asked participants to look at someone else's decision first, and then form their own opinion about it. Then they're asked to come up with their own decision based on that. And then when they did that, they found that participants often hold their estimates towards what that initial estimate was. And this is often referred to as anchoring. You may have heard this term. If you've ever had to buy or sell a house, you've probably heard about this, the fact that kind of the initial sale price for a home, a lot of the bids will come in around that area. And the study found that basically when someone forms his or her opinion, impacts how they evaluate the opinions of others. So if you present the opinion up front, then they have this anchoring, which is not good. It's also we know that wisdom of the crowds is more accurate than an expert. So how do we kind of avoid this anchoring in this case? So what about if we go ahead and form our opinions up front before we evaluate the opinions of others? So this is going to be the opposite of anchoring. You wouldn't get that effect anymore. But this only works if everyone actually agrees. More than likely, given two or more people, there's going to be some amount of disagreement that happens. So disagreement is not necessarily a bad thing. When it comes to wisdom of the crowds, it's those diverse judgments that actually lead to the better decision making. But in order for disagreement to be effectively leveraged, you have to interpret this problem. So what that kind of means is when there's disagreement, again, there is at least one or both or all parties that are wrong. If there is a right and a wrong, then at least one of them has to be wrong. So in this final study that this article mentioned here, they wanted to dig into this even further. So what they did was they asked people to make a decision before seeing the decision of another participant that was selected at random. And some saw decisions that were kind of close to what they were thinking about, others saw ones that were widely different from that. And then they asked them to evaluate the quality of the other person's decision. So they didn't know who it was, they just said, here's a decision, what do you think of that? And then what they found was that as that level of disagreement increased, the individuals felt less, they saw less of the person that they were evaluating. They didn't know who it was, they saw all this whole decision, they were just like, that decision is wrong, and they felt less about that person. But their opinions didn't change at all. They're like, my decision is right, this one is wrong, and they felt wrong with it. So this shows that basically forming opinions before evaluating the opinions of others leads to these social costs. Participants in the study thought less of the other person's estimates, and in some cases thought the other person was less ethical or intelligent. That's what they actually said. So they didn't, basically, this was trying to determine, okay, what are we going to do about this? They felt something negative about this person they didn't even know because they saw a decision that was not in line with their own ideas. So if we know that we want multiple independent judgments, but if we present the opinion up front, then we have anchoring, and if we wait later, there's the social cost. So it's like, kind of, what do we do in the situation? Is it hopeless? Is there no way to actually go ahead and make a effective group decision? So here's what the study found. They said that to maximize accuracy, team members should first form independent opinions in advance before coming together. This is to avoid the anchoring again. The groups of decision makers should also pre-commit to a strategy for combining those opinions. This could protect them from the negative social consequences there. And then the third, most interesting one, for teams facing quantifiable questions, they should aim for strategies that, as much as possible, try to remove human judgment in the analysis process. Which sounds great. I would love to remove human judgment, but like, how do I go and do that? We're all humans trying to make decisions. That sounds quite true. Now, I was in a situation a few years ago, very late to this conference. I was building a web app with my team at Comcast, and it was originally built in Polymer, which was Google's initial web component framework. So Chris, who spoke earlier, he actually shipped one of the first production Polymer web apps ever, according to Google. It was still in alpha, Polymer was, and we shipped that. So we built another app in Polymer. Then the Google team was like, hey, here's Polymer 3, and in the same breath, they said, and we're deprecating Polymer after we release Polymer 3. So we had this Polymer app, and we're like, okay, we need to rewrite this. We needed to find what framework we're going to rewrite that. Something that we all have to be faced with, via rewriting an existing project, or if we're launching a new one, what framework do we pick? So I explained this to my manager at the time. He was a VP. I said, hey, Google did this Christmas situation. We need to pick a new framework. So he's like, okay, John, I trust you to go ahead and make the right technical decision, but how do you know that the process you're used to come to that decision is going to be the best way to go about it? So he said, why don't you research that and then come back to me with what your decision is for what the framework is. So I was like, that sounds cool. So I did a bunch of research, and as I was looking throughout the internet about how to make good decisions, I found a bunch of research outside of tech that really kind of piqued my interest. There are a number of these peer-reviewed papers that were looking at something that was like much larger than anything I've ever had to do. And that is, they were analyzing what to do if a state or a country needs to build a new power plant to power whatever portion of the land and people live in. So this is a critical infrastructure decision that takes, you're going to live with this decision for 40, 50, 60 years. So this is like really big deal. I hope my code is not running in 60 years. So that's going to be a problem because 6 months ago, I looked at my code and I'm just like, that was a mess. So you do not want to mess up this decision at all. There's solar, there's wind, hydro, nuclear, all sorts of different options there. There's different types of nuclear power plants. So then how do you go ahead and make this decision? So all these papers were actually using something that is known as the analytic hierarchy process to arrive at how they would go ahead and make this decision. This was actually created over 45 years ago by a man named Thomas Saati. And the reason I like this is because it actually removes the emotion in the analysis. It's a structured way of making decisions that helps to kind of remove that loudest person in the room, or kind of try to help get the emotion out of the equation and figure out what is actually the best way to go about making a decision. And again, it's been around for over 45 years. If it can help make power plant decisions, it can help us with our JavaScript framework decisions, wherever decisions you have to make. So when you read about the analytic hierarchy process, which I'm going to say AHP because it's less words to say, there's often this example that they provide around choosing the most suitable leader. And the setup is basically some company, for whatever reason, needs to go ahead and choose a new leader. Why the previous leader is no longer available to lead us, but there's a need for a new leader. So it's useful, but let's have a little more fun than that. So what we're going to do is kind of pretend that we're at this mythical world with dragons, and we have to choose our new leader of this group. And the potential leaders we have are Astrid from How to Train Your Dragon, Princess Fiona from Shrek, and Eep, Crude from the Crudes. This is an advantage working for Comcast, which owns NBC Universal, which owns DreamWorks. I get to use their characters in my presentation. Just get that going for me. So here's how AHP works. There's three components to it. There's the goal, the thing you're trying to decide about. There's the criteria, how you're going to evaluate your decisions about that. And then what AHP calls the alternatives, which really are just the choices, what are we choosing among here. So in this case, our goal is to choose the most suitable leader. I've chosen these four criteria: experience, strength, charisma, and integrity. Whatever situation you apply to, you pick your own criteria that makes sense. And it's also important, you don't want to have any more than 8 for reasons that you'll see when I get to the kind of calculations. Kind of 8 is the maximum you want to deal with. And then our alternatives or choices, again, are Astrid, Fiona, and Eve. So once you have all this set up, you're going to do what are known as pairwise comparisons, which is just taking 2 things and carrying them into one with respect to something. So in this case, the very first example there, we've got Astrid and Fiona. We're going to take a look at the 2 of them and say, okay, in terms of experience, let's compare the two of them. We will then go through this process for basically every possible pair we can. So Fiona with E with Astrid. Then do that for strength for the same pairs. Do it for charisma, integrity. You can see there's a lot of pairwise comparisons you do here. Then for the criteria, we're going through that same process. So experience versus strength with respect to our goal. Do that pairwise comparison. You go through this process, so on and so forth. Now, I'll actually go through this process in detail for just one example, because again, it will take a long time to do all of them. But let's do again, Astrid and Fiona, level of experience, and also E. Like, what does this actually look like? So this is the scale for the pairwise comparisons. It's a scale from 1 to 9. The examples here are all in odd numbers. You can use even numbers if you want to. That's totally cool. If you want to use decimals, that works as well. I've used decimals really just for like 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and above that, I just go with integers above that up to 1. And the idea being essentially important things to take away from this is that if two things are for all intents and purposes equal, then they each get a 1. Their score is a 1. If the two things being compared are so wildly different, then basically in that case, the winner would get a 9 and then the loser gets a 1. So that's kind of basically the way you go about scaling, scoring in this scale of pairwise comparison. So again, we're going to look at, with respect to experience, we've got Astrid and Fiona. I'm just going to say at the start of this, we're going to say that Fiona is more experienced than Astrid. We're going to give her a 4. So that was kind of in the, going back to that scale there, in between moderate and strong importance. So moderately, strongly, that's kind of where her experience is for Fiona compared to Astrid. And then Astrid being the loser in this case, she's going to get a 1. Loser always gets a 1. Now we go ahead and compare Astrid to Eve. We'll actually say Astrid is more experienced than Eve, also a level of 4. So Astrid gets a 4, and Eve will get a 1, being the loser in this case. Now we compare Fiona to Eve. This is going to be a larger degree of difference there. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a 9 in this case. And then Eve will get a 1, and the loser always gets 1. This is our first kind of set of pairwise comparisons. Pretty straightforward in that case. Now, to go ahead and actually get the initial set of scores for AHP, we're going to build a table that looks like this. The way we fill this out is that initially, everyone compared to themselves is, again, exactly equal, so they all get a 1 in that case. Now we're going to take the winners. So in this case, we got Fiona compared to Astrid again. Fiona was the best, so she gets a 4 in her column and row. And then in the other one, the other blue one there, it's going to be the reciprocal, which if you remember from math back in whatever year of school that was, that basically means 1 over that same number. So you got 1 over 4 in that case. And then we'll repeat this process. So we had Astrid versus Eve. Astrid was the winner. She gets 4 in that case. Eve, who's bottom left, gets 1 over 4. And then Fiona compared to Eve was a 9. And then that last square there, we'll get the 1 over 9. So that's kind of the initial stuff we get for what is known as the priority of each. Priority is the word that they use in AHP with respect to experience. And then we can do some calculations. There are some numbers. You're like, where the heck do these come from? The answer is that they are based on vector math and also something known as the principal right and vector, which I didn't know what that word was or how to even pronounce it before AHP. Maybe you know what that's like, maybe not vector math. I read papers about this and why it's effective, and I've determined that I'm not qualified to say why it's effective based on those papers. But if you like math proofs, then there is a 6-page like math proof that Thomas Ati wrote, and he says, well, like, this is exactly why like the aim vector helps to remove the human emotional elements out of it. And I'm just like, hey, it's been around for 45 years and it's still being used. This must be, it's good for me. When I graduated with my master's degree, I was happy to never write a math proof again. So reading them is just, I was getting like, I don't want to deal with math proofs again. But again, it works. If that's your thing, just Google that. You can find it. Google his name and then like principal right name vector will pop right up. So go ahead. So now we've got these numbers, which basically, again, the priority is what they call that. So this is our first set of comparisons and our first set of priorities. We can plug this into our graph and kind of start to see how this is going to play out. Now we need to repeat this process for each one of the different criteria. So we'll do that again for strength, for charisma, for integrity. I can go through that. You can kind of imagine how it would play out. And then you need to do the same thing for the criteria with respect to the goal. So here's an example table of what that could look like. Again, so I was evaluating each of the criteria the way that I thought it should be done with respect to the goal. Give the reciprocals, give the principal rate and vector HP magic formula thing. We got some answers there. So you can kind of see in this case that basically I have evaluated this to mean that experience is the most important thing. Other things, not so much. And then this is where the math gets actually easy, and my kids that are in electrical school can actually do the math. It's pretty straightforward. And the way that we're going to line the final math calculations are as follows. So again, we're going to go down the first path, which was we better have 3 leaders with respect to experience, trying to find that goal. So we're going to take the priority that I just showed you, that 0.547, put that in the graph between experience and the goal, and then take our priorities of our 3 leaders with respect to experience, put that in the graph. You can kind of see that there is this path from the leaders through experience that has these different numbers in it. So we can just plug these into a table here, the individual priorities of the leaders, and then grab that experience with respect to the goal number, plug that into this table. And then to get the priority with respect to experience, I'm just going to go ahead and multiply these 2 things. So our initial priorities for the individuals versus the goal priority, kind of the weight you think about that as. And then you get some more numbers there. So in this case, this is again the criteria, the priority of the criteria of experience in this case. Now we take these numbers, we plug them into a final table. So I've got that left column here. Do that same exercise for the other ones there. We got all the numbers here, and then we just go ahead and add them up. And that gives us our final numbers. You can kind of see in this case that the winner is going to be Fiona. Congratulations, Princess Fiona. Happy to have you as our leader. Awesome stuff. And again, HP helped us to arrive at this decision. Now, if you follow HP by the book, you're actually supposed to collect the numbers via a survey filled out by individuals in advance. And that way, they're not influenced by this. I talked about that earlier. You don't want to have anchoring come into play in this case. But when we use HP at Comcast, the first time I tried this out, I was like, I want to still have some thoughts around, why are we picking these numbers? And it was our first time doing this as well. So what we did was actually kind of the same that we evaluate the story points for a story when we're doing like agile poker planning. So we all did come up with our numbers in advance, but we came together and one by one for these pairwise comparisons said, okay, we're talking about Fiona and Eve perspective experience. Everybody throw in a number there. And if numbers were different, we had a discussion on that, and then we collectively talked until we could arrive at what was the number going to be for that pairwise comparison. And the team actually found that those discussions were more valuable than what the tool in the end showed us what the number was. And I find this similar to the Hana Highway in Maui, which if you've ever had the privilege of doing this drive, you know what I'm talking about. It's this basically long, winding drive to the north coast of Maui. It's beautiful. There's all these amazing places to stop. There's waterfalls, there's amazing flowers, there's awesome waves to look at. And then when you get to Hana, you don't know you're in Hana unless you happen to see the sign that is there. And there's a beach here that is kind of unassuming by Hawaiian standards. So what people often say is that when it comes to the Hana Highway, it's not the journey, or it is the journey. It's not the destination. You're doing this for the journey, not to get to Hana, because there's a lot of cool things you see along the way, but Hana is just an interesting place in Hawaii. And I kind of compare this to the HP pairwise comparison. It was, for us in this case, the journey and the destination were both useful. Because those discussions were really valuable. And the tool gave us an answer, and it turned out, in some cases it's the same. Actually, in every case it's been the same. So what we thought the answer was going to be, those discussions kind of led us to that answer by its own. So you might be wondering, kind of like, what do we decide? How do we evaluate these frameworks? So back when we did this initially, this was, at this point, probably 5 years or so ago. These were our criteria. So we had community, performance, Redux compatibility, web component support, localization, developer productivity, and what I'm calling hybrid app support, because we were using it both for a progressive web app and as part of WebViews in a native app. And again, I mentioned the fact that you don't have any more than 8. We had 7 in this case. And the reason is the more items you have, then the number of pairwise comparisons kind of moves up exponentially. So in this case, we had to do 21 different pairwise comparisons for these. And then that was just for each of the criteria. So we have 3 different frameworks we were debating amongst ourselves. So we had 21 pairs comparisons among them, and then we also had to evaluate all these different criteria, which was another 21, so we had 40 pair comparisons. And we actually ended up having a few more other ideas around different criteria, but we determined they would be the same across all three frameworks, so we just didn't include them in the calculations because they weren't going to impact those calculations. Then here's what our weights ended up looking like. So you can see in this case, our group valued community performance the most, but it's developer productivity a little bit below that, and then other ones not as much. And then you can kind of look at how this plays into the actual final decision. So in this case, I'm not going to tell you what the frameworks were or what one won. You can see, how our different criteria, how the weights of those criteria influence our decisions. And the tool I used to create these, I've open sourced it. So you can go ahead and actually use this today. This is the URL for that. And when you go there, you'll see something that looks like, I'll show you in a second, keep taking pictures. And I can share these slides afterwards too. It's pretty basic. You've got some inputs there for you can put in what are your criteria, then add in your options or alternatives in that case. Then you can go ahead and start building those pairwise comparisons. And in this case, I found that I was getting confused, like, okay, when I'm putting in numbers, like which one is the winner in this case? So I did the green to signify that's the winner column you put in a number. If you're colorblind, I put a little trophy emoji there, so it's very clear that just like, okay, when you enter in this case 5, it was charisma was the winner, integrity was the loser, and then automatically fills in the reciprocal for you. So you can build that table quickly and understand how you go about it. Same case here, you do the pairwise comparisons for each with respect to each other. And then at the end, when you have all those numbers in place, there's a big calculate button, you can hit that, and then you get your weighted criteria and your actual answers there. Now, I do want to kind of talk about what we learned about this process. At this point now, we've used this many times throughout Comcast, and I've talked to other people, other companies, other ones that used it. And it's really been useful for us, but I'll say if you have another framework in place for making decisions, you don't need to switch to this, but just kind of make sure that like your framework is meeting the same needs we found in this one goes. So I'll start with what went well, which clearly was a number of things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been here to talk to you about this. So the first thing was that, again, many teams at Comcast have found this useful. Every time I've explained the process to a team, I said, okay, here's what we used it for. Here's how the process works. Tell me how it goes. I want to hear if there's flaws in this thing, if there's issues you have with it. Because it's been useful for us, but we're just one group. I want to hear how other teams are using it. And everyone said, like, they've done the process like this is great. Like, we got to a decision, we agreed to it, we got buy-in. I'm like, that's awesome. Another useful aspect of this is that if your team puts together architecture decision records, which are also known as ADRs, or just something about documenting your decisions, then this is great because it shows the motivation behind why you arrived at the decision. It's not just, we're moving to OTEL for observability. It's just, why are we doing it? It's the thing that OTEL provides. In my role at Comcast, being the highest ranking IC in the front-end world, I often get asked, hey, what framework should we use? And I always say, okay, here's the ADR from when we picked a framework. Don't just pick the framework because our team at that time picked the framework. Look at how we did it. Look at our criteria. Think about what criteria matters to you, and then apply the same process to your team. Another piece of feedback I received last year was when there was a couple teams. One was at Comcast, one was at Sky, who we also own. They're based in the UK. And those two teams were deciding between basically Comcast had one piece of software, Sky had one as well, and they knew they needed to kind of work better together and decide, are we going to pick with the Comcast software or the Sky software or go green? Now, for a bunch of engineers, you don't need to have a process to say, like, we want to go greenfield and rewrite the thing. But we went through the process anyway. And actually, what the engineers said was that going through the process was an excellent onboarding for both teams. So again, we had teams across the ocean, happily met with each other, and they spent a few hours going through the process, learning about each other's systems. So that way, when they came to the decision, which was we're going to go greenfield, they knew kind of the systems that Comcast had done well, where they had learned, and the systems that Sky had done well. So they kind of knew where the expertise was, what problems each group had learned about, and they were able to apply those in the greenfield system. That kind of led to, again, an initial great way to get the engineers working together well, and it led to a better product, a better greenfield product, because you kind of have the learnings that you got up front. Instead of building greenfield, uncovering issues, and then having to redo stuff, they almost had two greenfield processes, two greenfield systems that they learned from to build a new greenfield system, which was a huge time saver in that case, and again, great for onboarding. Another thing to note is that there's different ways to go ahead and kind of handle who does the scoring exercise. So going back to this example here, you might have one group that really, they understand the criteria and how these are going to relate to the goal. So you're going to have, in one case, like our product owners, they understand for a certain goal how those criteria match up to it. So we're going to have the product team go ahead and do those comparisons. But maybe these criteria are actually engineering focused. So like the engineers know what are the best ways to handle 3 different technical options against criteria. So we have an engineering group do those. And that is totally cool. You can basically go ahead and make the system work however you want to. I've had different product teams do different sets, do their own evaluations of criteria. It was the same set of criteria. So that way the engineers kind of were able to do, okay, I've got our evaluations for how the criteria work out. But then each product owner for different apps they owned, maybe the decision was different based on it. Now, of course, nothing is perfect, and HP is no different. So a few things that we've learned about that could use some improvement, which things to be mindful of when it comes to HP. So early in our HP usage days in Comcast, again, I mentioned it was successful a few times. And then we had a very, very big decision that we were facing in our group. No one's going to lose their job over this decision, but it was going to be one that we knew was going to be ruffling some feathers, and people were going to be not happy about, certain groups are not going to be happy about it, no matter what we chose. So leadership came to me and said, John, can you help go through the HP process for that? I'm like, sure, done it before, can do it again. And they made a couple tweaks to it though that ended up actually backfiring. So one was they said, well, we released the decision. We just want to say okay, we used HP and here's the decision. And they didn't want us to put together or release kind of what the numbers were and what the actual tool put out in the end and why that was the decision. And that actually caused more problems. It really backfired because teams were just like, okay, I just don't want to be told I need to do this. I want to know why. What was the thing behind that? So there was a lot of pushing back on the fact that we didn't release the numbers. And then I went ahead and was like, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to say, here are the numbers. But that was weeks later, and the damage was already done at that point. It was just kind of too late at that respect. And I've learned since then that the reason why is due to this concept known as name-a-washi, which has anyone actually heard of this term before? All right, so it's like most things. I heard about this first maybe 2 years ago, and then once I hear about it, I see it more often. And it actually comes from the world of Japanese gardening, hence the little plant there in the hand there. And it's a special technique for uncovering roots when you transplant a tree. But in business, in Japan, this term is used as a way of building consensus openly, not forcing consensus. Basically, it's being very caring about how you go ahead and get consensus and drive towards consensus. And this is really an incredibly powerful process way to think about how you can make decisions. So for name-a-washi, the way it works is you start with an idea, a concept, a problem statement, and then you identify different groups of people you want to target in what I'll call pre-conversations, kind of the meeting before the meeting. And these people are going to be the decision makers and people that kind of have the power to drive or enforce a decision. The makers that will go ahead and do the work once the decision is made. People that could end up blocking the idea. Perhaps the biggest one of those are going to be impacted or affected by the idea or the decision in this case. So then in those pre-conversations, the objective is to basically inform what you're trying to do and what information you gathered so far, gather feedback and improve upon the idea with the goal of making the idea better for everyone involved. Now, these conversations can be very open and very transparent, and most of the time it's a mix of some kind of informal conversations and some kind of more formal, private, smaller discussions, because you kind of want to make sure that everyone has a chance to kind of weigh in with you if you're the one gathering information to say hey, and you're not trying to force people to make decisions or change their mind forcibly. And you just kind of continue the cycle until everyone is in agreement. And then that leads to basically a meeting where everyone comes in and then you basically say, okay, we've been talking about this, we decided this is the way to go, and everyone nods their head and approves because they were all involved in those other smaller conversations that come. And this actually maps really well to AHP. The idea stage is the goal in our AHP graph. We identify then who we're going to have participate in that AHP process. So this is going to be those that are going to be in that process. So either directly involved in the process, giving the numbers, or making sure that they kind of are delegates or representatives for the group they represent to provide those numbers in the AHP process. And then the inform, gather, and prove stage is basically those conversations that I mentioned, and the information gathering in that case to kind of humble pairwise comparisons of what those numbers are going to be. And then when you have your decision, that's really just hitting the button on your AHP calculations. One of the mistakes that I made with AHP, again, with that kind of first time we were picking the JS framework, was, again, I mentioned the fact that my VP was like, hey, John, do some research there, and then come to me in the end. So when we hit that button and we're like, oh, this is the answer, I was excited about it. So I took the group down to my VP's office and said, hey, good news, we went through this process. It was a great process. We're going with option 1. We're excited about that. And he's like, I thought you were going to pick option 2. So then it was like, okay, don't surprise people above you with decisions, kind of say things in Washington there, just kind of let them know in advance before you shock them with large groups of people showing up your office to say it's not what he expected us to pick. But the best part of Nemawashi, I'd say, is if you're like me and find yourself in a lot of meetings, that actually these smaller meetings kind of lead to less meetings overall. So again, you're kind of talking to people individually or in smaller group settings, and that leads to less big meetings, which kind of tend to lead to other big meetings because you can't make a decision in the first big meeting. So that's been great for me and my schedule. I can spend some time doing code otherwise, which is what I really love to do. So to conclude this part of the retrospective, learn from our mistakes. AHP writing the process does not make hard decisions less painful. Going back to my question at the top there around, when I said Python was in the program language, think about that, how that might have made you feel for just a silly thing about just playing Python is the best. If this is a decision that really impacts you and your team, think about how it's going to make those people feel, think about what you felt, and have empathy for those involved. And again, do not hide the data. This hurts the effectiveness of the decision, and it actually hurts the buy-in for it when they can't see why a decision was made. So before I close this out, I do want to note that, I've mentioned, I've talked about this before. Actually, after one conference, I spoke about this. The team at the New York Times tried this out. They wrote about it on their blog there, so you can check it out here. In this case, it was the identity team. They were picking a new ID format for the New York Times. And they blogged about it, 7-minute read there according to that. So go check that out. Just someone else that went through this process and they enjoyed it and they found that it was valuable. So it's not just me and people that I've known, it's also been, other ones in tech have found this useful. The final thing I want to mention is actually kind of the thing that led to me wanting to actually make this into a conference talk. And that was a few years ago, there was another group in Comcast and they had to make a decision. So they were giving a presentation about, the decision that they made. And they said that basically someone asked, how did you go ahead and make this decision? And they said, well, we had a pro list, a cons list, we looked at that, we decided this was the best option in this case. And they actually said, we did not use AHP for this decision. And that decision actually died in that meeting. They did not go with that decision. And that when I saw the fact that someone didn't use the process and it killed the decision, I'm like, okay, wow, I guess people actually did buy into AHP and it's actually working for us. And again, it's been valuable for us. Decisions big and small. JS frameworks is just like, hey, we want to pick between 2 things for demo pages, and that was like a 10-minute exercise. So again, it's been great to see kind of people buy into this, and it's been useful for us to get buy-in for decisions using this tool. So that's all I have to say about that. We got a few minutes for questions, so if anyone has any questions, happy to take them. So go ahead.
How long should a team plan on dedicating for trying to answer a question in this process?
That is a great question. So for the framework decision we went through initially, again, that was 7 criteria, 3 frameworks. That was, I think it was 5 hours total.
Wow.
It was like, we set aside 3 hours. I'm like, we cannot get done in 3 hours. I realized that 2 hours in. I've also done decisions that were like, okay, we've got 2 choices, 3 criteria, and we did it in 15 minutes. So it kind of depends on your team's familiarity with the process, because once you do it a few times, kind of you know how it's going to play out, move quicker. So I dedicate more time up front initially, and then also just how many criteria and how big is the scope. But that's just some, again, it's a ranger, but that's to give you an idea about our experience there. Yep.
Yeah, you mentioned a pros cons list at the end there for the team. I was wondering if y'all tried any other decision-making frameworks and how this compared to those experiences.
We've done other ones where kind of like informal, just like coming up with weights, just like, okay, these are just like, here's pros and cons, here's important things, here's like a 2 versus a 1. But the thing I like about HP is, again, it kind of really helps nail down, it's not just a linear scale or just like it's really based on that. So that's what we found that this has been really valuable. So it's been the best one we found for us. Yeah.
Frameworks, there's a lot of information to know or not know, and you have a lot of different folks scoring. Is there some kind of expectation that you set as to like kind of pre-material that folks should be familiar with going into these activities?
Yeah, so for that, a good example there is like performance. It's just like, okay, how do we evaluate the performance of these different frameworks? So it's just like, for that one, we had a few individuals kind of like research that and bring the data back to the team. And that's where, again, too, where we've had, again, some cases where we had the criteria evaluations with respect to the goal was one group, and then the choices with respect to the criteria was a different group. And that's cool too. You can kind of look for like who are those that are the best to make those evaluations, or do these evaluations are important. There's also a case where it was 2 technical decisions, and I was not directly involved, but I knew that a few of the individuals were kind of stronger willed and louder typically in meetings. So I'm just like, let me just kind of supervise this, make sure that they don't kind of like almost use the tool as a weapon and try to force people to change their numbers in the wrong way. So like I've done that too. In that one group between like Comcast and Sky, I was just brought as like the facilitator to help them understand it, and then like they kind of ran with it. So I didn't need to. By the times I've been like there, it's almost there to be like, it's not a tool. Any tool you can really understand, like how can I game it? And I'm more there to we're here to like use this as a conversation piece to arrive at. Any other questions? All right, cool. Like I said, I'm John Riv. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky. I'll get you these out so you can see the slides. And again, thanks for your time. Cool.